when you learn to deal with fast speech. It is the most exhilarating, wonderful, rewarding feeling you can possibly imagine. And this is the question we're going to get into today on the StoryLearning Podcast. So what do you need to be able to do in order to understand a native speaker on the streets? It's something that every single language learner can experience, and it strikes fear into the heart of anyone who actually learns a language and then goes out to use it in the real world. And it's that moment when you are talking to someone, so a native speaker out in the real world, on the street, in a restaurant, whatever it may be. You're trying to have a conversation. They reply to you in fast, natural language, and you just blank. You don't get what they say. You understand some words, but you haven't quite caught the meaning, and then you just stare back at them like a dumb child, and you feel about this small. We all know what this feels like. It's one of the most difficult, challenging, disconcerting elements of language learning. It's also the bit that when you learn how to survive these situations, when you learn to deal with fast speech, it is the most exhilarating, wonderful, rewarding feeling you can possibly imagine. And this is the question we're going to get into today on the StoryLearning Podcast. And this question comes from CJ Tuscany, who asks, what about the hearing understanding issue when you can understand in the standard language, but in the streets, they say something that sounds completely different? I'm stuck between completing full sentences without pause and then terrified when people on the street ask me questions. Right? I mean, anyone listening to this knows exactly how CJ Tuscany feels here. So I'm going to walk you through why this happens and then give you some suggestions for what to do about it. The most obvious thing that I'm going to talk about in this episode is the fact that you just got to do a lot of listening, right? That's not the only part. There's more to it. But one thing that you cannot do is not listen. And so I've created a list of my favorite TV and podcasts, movies and podcasts in over 15 languages, which for me are quite good for language learning because they're in that kind of sweet spot where they're not quite, they're a lot of native speaker movies and things like that, they're just too difficult, they're too random and abstract. These ones that I've selected are actually really useful for language learning whilst also being challenging. You can download this for free with the link in the description. We might be putting a QR code on the screen as well if you're watching on video. Like I said, it's a list of movies and podcasts in over 15 languages, great language learning material. So the best thing you could do right now if you want to start to improve your ability to understand native speakers is just choose some stuff from that list and just start immersing yourself in that every day, because unless you do that, you're never going to get closer to listening. So that's my first gambit. But, and it's worth talking, look, you will know, you dear listener, viewer, will know whether or not you actually do enough listening. Frankly, if you're not doing at least an hour a day of real listening, and I don't mean listening to your textbook, I mean listening to extensive speech in movies or podcasts. Unless you do at least an hour a day, you're not spending anywhere near enough time actually listening to the language. And so you're never going to be able to get over this. You're never going to be able to develop the ability to really understand fast speech. So let's just have this as a reality check. Are you spending at least an hour a day actually listening to, immersed in the language? Not study, but actually immersed in it. Yes or no, it's a simple question, yes or no. If the answer is no, well, look, step number one, just do more of that. But let's talk about the other things that feed into this, because when you are on the street and you're talking to someone, there are a number of different factors at play. So let me just outline what those things are. So what do you need to be able to do in order to understand a native speaker on the streets? Well, first of all, you need vocabulary, all right? And so you need to know enough vocabulary in the language to be able to understand enough stuff. So so much of language learning up until the upper intermediate level is just a question of accumulating vocabulary. You need to know a few thousand words at least. There's many different ways of learning those words. I've recorded many other podcasts on how to do that. But there is a critical mass of vocabulary you need, and until you know that vocabulary, there isn't much to talk about here really, because how are you going to understand something if you don't know the word, right? The other thing is that, and as you've mentioned, CJ, is that native speakers often use slang that you don't find in your textbook, right? Just for example, it was a silly example. I was playing tennis with some Italians the other day, and one of the women I was playing with was every time a friend did a good shot, she would shout "be." Now, "be" is short for bene, But they don't say bene, they say me. And you wouldn't know that. You're not going to see this in a textbook, right? The only way you're going to know this is if you've actually had interaction with real people in real situations. Now, that's a very simple example, but like that example, there are many, 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 many more. But my point is that people speak in a different way in real life, right? And so that's the vocabulary question. We need to know enough words, and we also need to know enough of like how those words are used and the words that are actually used in real life. So the vocabulary question. The next thing is a question of connected speech. Now, connected speech is when we say words in a sentence, but words blend together. So, for example, let's take that word, for example, right? When I say the word in a fast sentence, it becomes for example. The r blends into the air. The r at the end of for blends into the air of example, which creates for example. And if you didn't know what those two words were, it would sound like one word, one single word that is for example. What's a for example? No, it's for example, but connected speech is when these words blend together. Sometimes the sounds change. Take the tube station in London, Green Park. Green with an N, green park. But when we say it quickly, it's Green Park. The N at the end of green becomes a M, like M, Green Park. Try saying it quickly. Green Park, M. Your lips come together, which means it changes into an M sound, right? So the way that we pronounce words and say words changes in fast speech. So we need to be able to deal with that in the language. We need to be able to know what changes. Next is a question of mindset. Now, this is, on the face of it, is not a linguistic thing, but actually it really, really is. When you stop and talk to someone in the street, there's a part of you that's panicking, right? Now, that panic is going to be greater for some of us than for others. Nevertheless, there is a part of you that panics. Mindset is your ability to self-govern in that situation and say, yeah, I'm nervous, but I'm going to hold myself together. I'm going to pay full attention, and I'm not going to let my sense of shame or my sense of embarrassment throw me off balance, right? And this comes from practice. We have to control our mindset. We have to stay positive and just like be our own biggest fangirl when we're in those situations. And then the last thing is stamina. Now, stamina is the ability to carry on even when you're tired and even when your brain hurts. There's one moment I can think of in my language learning past where I actually felt my stamina muscles growing. And this was when I was in the Canary Islands. I had some very good friends in the Canary Islands. And I remember being out in a bar with my friend Thomas and like 10 of his friends from school. And if you could imagine being in a bar in the Canary Islands with 10 school friends who have obviously got like an entire lifetime, 40 years of like slang and in-jokes and all of that. And I was there all night, and it got to like 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning. We were still going, still talking. And I remember sitting there and I was like trying to keep up. And it was really tough because I was a bit drunk, which actually helps. I was tired. It was a foreign language and my brain was throbbing from the effort. But I kept up and I forced myself to keep going. And you know, after you've been in that situation for hours and hours on end, and you get through it, your stamina grows, it's like muscles that get bigger. Your stamina grows. And I remember that as a real inflection point in my Spanish where I felt like, if I can get through this, I can get through absolutely anything. And so stamina comes from actually doing it over and over and over again. So it's very closely correlated with mindset, meaning that if you want to get better at stopping and talking to people in the street in Italy, for example, you need to do a lot of stopping and talking to people in the street in Italy, because every time you do it, your stamina is going to improve, your mindset is going to get stronger, and everything is going to get easier, right? So we've got to do all of these things. We've got to increase our vocabulary systematically and intentionally. We've got to learn to deal with connected speech so we understand how things change, how words change in fast speech. We've got to develop this real positive attitude, and we've got to do a lot of it. That is what's needed in order to actually get really good at dealing with this street talk. And it's a lot, and it comes from huge amounts of practice, frankly. You cannot do this from a kind of home study environment. You can get a lot of the way there, and I'm going to give you some tips now, but let's not kid ourselves. You've got to be out there doing a lot of this in order to make it work. So How to do it. Number one, lots of listening. I gave you my list of binge-worthy TV and podcast resources. Just start listening a lot every day. Next is, like I said before, you've got to put yourself in these social situations, right? It's very difficult to talk to people on the street because there's social anxiety involved. If I was learning a new language now, I would really put a lot of time and focus on trying to find communities, friends, people who I could spend a lot of time with, one way or another. It's difficult, right? It takes effort, it takes willpower, but it's one of those things where unless and until you are really spending a lot of time with people, you're going to find it difficult to improve. And trying to do this with people that you know and who you have a connection with in a club or a team or in a friendship group is a lot easier than the pressure of doing it on the street, right? Now, next is vocabulary. And listen, honestly, the biggest way to improve your vocabulary is reading. And I know that people often say, oh, well, if you read a lot, you get good at reading, but you don't get good at speaking or listening. Like, not true. Reading grows your vocabulary like nothing else. So read a lot, your vocabulary will grow. In turn, you're going to just be able to navigate conversations a lot more easily. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is intensive listening. And intensive listening is when you don't just have a movie on in the background, you're not just talking with friends. Instead, you put on some text of some kind and you are actually actively listening and trying to figure out what that is. And one of my favorite ways of doing this is with a transcription exercise. So you would find something you're interested in that you find difficult, put on some headphones, listen to it over and over again and try to write down every single word you hear. And when it's difficult, you play it over and again like 5, 10, 15 times. And you really listen intensively and you try to just copy everything, figure out what's being said. And ideally then you have the text so you can actually go in and cross-reference that and see what's actually being said. You know, with Netflix, you have subtitles now, right? So what you could do, and it's never Netflix is not great for this, honestly, because just sitting with a TV remote is just not very convenient. Audio I think is much better. But whatever, it doesn't matter. The thing that you are interested in is the best. Like, I remember once I did this with Japanese. I had a half-hour TV show as a Japanese drama of some kind. And I just sat down, and over the course of a few days, it took a long time, but over the course of a few days, I sat down and I transcribed every single word just from listening to the audio. And it was the most incredible exercise because it just forces you to listen in the kind of depth and for the kind of detail that you just never would otherwise have time to do, right? So I would be really trying to do all of these things. You're putting yourself in social situations. You're doing a lot of passive listening. You're reading a lot of vocabulary, and you're also doing this intensive listening to make sure that you can hear this connected speech. You can hear the way that people talk. So, CJ Tuscany, I hope this has given you some things to think about. We've talked about we've talked about the nature of the difficulty of understanding people on the street, and we've talked about how to actually go about improving your listening skills. A couple of things that we have at StoryLearning that can help here. So I have a program called Conversations, which was designed for exactly this. It's at the intermediate level, so depending on what level you're at, it may be more or less useful. But if you're kind of in this intermediate plateau, Conversations is essentially a long audio course that is in the form of a soap opera, right? And it's in 20 chapters, and it tells this story of two people who move out of the big city and go into the local town. And it's written very, very carefully at the intermediate level, but using casual speech, casual forms. And it comes with, you've got the audio story, you've got the transcriptions, and the story itself is really, really good. And so for anyone at intermediate level, this would be really, really useful to look at. We have this in lots of different languages. I'll put a link in the description. And lastly, if you're learning Russian, anyone learning Russian, we have something called the Russian Immersion Lab. And this is kind of something we tried out in Russian first to see if we wanted to develop it into other languages. I think we probably will. But currently we only have it for Russian. But if you're learning Russian, again, we'll put a link in the description here to Immersion Lab. Immersion Lab is basically a huge number of spontaneous recorded conversations between two Russian people. And it's not planned, it's not scripted in any way. It's just like raw, authentic conversations, obviously with the transcripts and everything and the video so you can follow along. This is just like a really great way to get lots of listening practice. So again, that is in the description. That's it for now. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you back in the next episode of the podcast.